Anyway, welcome everybody to the February 13th, 2024 edition of the Idaho Department of Labor's Labor Market Insight Series. My name is Craig Shaw, and I am the Labor Market Information Research Supervisor at the department and your host for the webinar. Today we have Ryan Whiteside, our economist in Idaho Falls office, who will be exploring the topic of rural, which is big and varied in its scope, and he should do a good job of explaining a little bit of it today. And today for our Valentine's Day edition, I think this is probably an appropriate one because rural is so much what defines Idaho and why people love to live here and choose to move here is its rural nature and qualities which they love. So that's my little attempt to tie it into Valentine's Day, so however good or bad that was. Some housekeeping notes to start. This presentation is being recorded. It will be uploaded to YouTube for later viewing, and we'll send out a link that you can access the video, as well as a link where you can find the previous webinars that our labor economists have provided as part of our series. In addition, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and plug those in as we go. We're changing our format up a little bit for this one. We're going to be providing a space at the end for questions, so just make sure that you stay tuned for that bit. So again, Ryan's presentation this morning is an important topic, and it's complex, and it's certainly something that's relevant to things that are, just the lifestyle in Idaho. So Ryan, I'm going to turn it over to you and give you the remainder of the time. The time's yours.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you to all those who've chosen to join, and hopefully this is insightful for you as it has been for me with a lot of the research that we've been undertaking with this topic. Also, just the topic itself and what we're going to be writing about for the next month's analysis piece that you can look for that I'll be authoring as well for rural Idaho. So thank you for the forum here, and we'll go ahead and get started. The rural concept is basically, it means a lot of things to a lot of different people. As Craig mentioned, it is a pretty broad topic, and the definition itself can mean a lot of different things. So I'm going to attempt to define a few items as it pertains to rural, and at the end we'll be able to entertain any questions, as Craig mentioned, as to what some of those definitions are. And then we'll also be going in several different directions with the rural conversation and some of the things that are being considered. Based on my own rural Idaho experience, we've in-migrated, out-migrated, and we're back here in Idaho again as a family. My wife and boys have kind of lived the rural Idaho paradigm before, having moved away and back to Idaho several times. We've actually been drawn back to Idaho for several different reasons, but we have lived the rural experience a couple different times, and I kind of wanted to share that experience with you at the forefront here. The first time that we migrated to the Gem State was from Chicago, and we lived here for only 6 months in a rural unincorporated area of Idaho. And the second stint was actually a longer stay when we moved back to Idaho, 5 years, having a career and owning a home here. Again, living in another rural unincorporated area of Idaho, this time from Salt Lake City. So finally, we're here now. We've kind of planted our roots as of 2022. We live in Idaho Falls. We are in an urban area, but most having recently moved from Tampa, Florida, from another urban area out of state. So why did we choose rural Idaho during the first two family moves from urban areas, no less? And simply put, for us, it was a change of pace and subjectively better quality environment to raise kids in Idaho in general. And then why did we settle ultimately in Idaho's largest metroplex outside of the Idaho Falls area, outside of the Boise metroplex, into Idaho Falls? And perhaps you could call it a new preference, a new set of values. In some, it was basically reevaluating our personal preferences and amenities that were offered here, as anybody would consider when they're moving to a location. So in all three instances, I think there was an opportunity cost that we weighed in making the decision to move to Idaho, whether it was an urban area or two other rural areas that we were in. And for this webinar, for the sake of what we're talking about, we wanted just to define rural in kind of a crossover fashion. And it's meant to inform everybody that's the audience here, and to kind of drive home the point that rural does mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So we will be drawing on some of those comparisons in some of these slides and analysis that have taken place. So with the rural Idaho conversation, first of all, rural partners throughout all regions of Idaho completed a survey for the state back in 2020 asking about rural development in their communities. And those respondents on that survey included mayors, city clerks, treasurers, commissioners, and other elected officials with the goal of addressing challenges that faced rural Idaho in particular. And some of what the respondents had to say were in the form of what were the top three challenges that were extrapolated from that survey. And the top three challenges reportedly facing rural Idaho from those respondents in 2020 were lack of employment opportunities, affordable housing, more specifically as it related to workforce housing in their particular jurisdictions, and then also perhaps inadequate infrastructure. So those were the top three concerns based on that survey of leaders within the state living in rural environments and rural jurisdictions. So the perception from an urbanite or a suburbanite is there is an inherent opportunity cost, as I mentioned earlier, in choosing to live rural or choosing to live urban. What is one giving up to live in a rural environment? And in exchange, what is one giving up by living rural, and vice versa? It kind of goes back and forth in that manner. You could be considering proximity to work and people, commuting times, if you have neighbors or not. There's a lot of considerations. Speaking personally, we wanted to be able to drop our kids off 5 minutes from school rather than a 1 hour bus route each way from a rural area like our kids used to do. Another thing could be connectivity, and that could include just general communication or broadband or internet access, the amenities offered in a particular geography, by way of education. That could be colleges, universities, where the high schools are located, where middle schools and so on are located. Healthcare, the access to clinics and hospitals. Of course, how far it is to get there in an emergency is considered. The lifestyle, and then the demographics of living in those areas, as well as the cost of living. And living rural versus urban is kind of a decision that's weighed as well, especially with inflation. And then finally, income considerations. It may not affect people that telecommute, but of course it may affect people that are working and living in those jurisdictions. So we chose to live only about a mile from hospitals. Right now, it used to be it would take us 20 minutes to get to hospitals. We can virtually walk to shopping and other amenities like restaurants and things within the Idaho Falls city limits. Very little commute time compared to living on the outskirts of town like we did before. But conversely, there are some things that we do miss, and there are aspects of rural life, such as no traffic, obviously, a small town feel. Most people know each other. The relationships that we had in those areas, you can't really put a price on that. And then, of course, having maybe a larger lot to live on, more property, is definitely something that we would miss in moving here. So we were relative newcomers. We are newcomers, like our family fueled a lot of the population growth in rural areas. And based on a simple economic proposition, it was a great view, and it's kind of cheaper to live there. So those are some considerations that we made with our lifestyle at the time, and then moving back to Idaho Falls. And the low cost of living rural allows residents to get more bang for their buck. The rural parts of the states have a lot of things working in their favor. tourist destinations right in their backyards. The fishing and hunting is great. They have the great outdoors year round, and it may be a nice place to retire as well, for those that are of that age and those looking ahead. Statewide, there's been record-breaking population growth, as we're all aware, and the pandemic obviously added to this trend, and it encouraged workers to leave congested and more urban hubs outside the state and immigrate to Idaho, and then decidedly to work from here as well, and telecommute or telework, whatever the case may be. So basically, if remote work remains widespread, rural counties that do house remote workers here in Idaho could potentially benefit from a decisive price advantage in the short term by living rural instead. And the Idaho Department of Labor did conduct a business climate survey that I wanted to allude to. The results from last year from that business climate survey, 11% of the total employment in Idaho from that sample of respondents was reportedly either remote workers or hybrid workers. Just over half of those 11% worked fully remote here in Idaho. So that was something that was kind of a revelation, that many people did work remote. And in some regions of the state, it was even higher than that. That's kind of just the average with the combined 6 regions. So it's kind of interesting, kind of the people's paradigm shift in how they want to work and where they want to work and where they want to live. So if we frame rural Idaho, in the minds of some, rural Idaho may be referring to people, demographics, or population, or it could refer to the land itself. That could be rural private land that's inhabitable or public land that's uninhabitable. It could be the farms and ranches, the fish and game areas, the publicly managed U.S. Department of Interior lands. These are places that people enjoy and visit, but don't necessarily live, of course. BLM lands, again, publicly managed USDA lands, and the USDA administers our forests, a lot of the forests, if they're national forests. And then the rural economy itself, tying into that conversation. So that's kind of how a lot of people conceive rural Idaho. It could be a place that you visit, it could be a place that you live, and everybody has kind of a different ideal subjective in their mind on how to define rural themselves. With the socioeconomic indicators, this is one way that we can kind of narrow down this consideration. It's kind of a socioeconomic look at how both the United States Department of Agriculture and the United States Census look at the rural population, and they both use the same definition, by the way. It is a socioeconomic perspective because there's diverse dispositions and circumstances of different people that we serve, especially in the Idaho Department of Labor and the diverse population of Idaho that we do have, and the various needs and stations in life of those folks living all over the state. So the first thing we look at with the rural population indicators would be the percentage of the population that's considered rural, and then the percentage of the land that's considered rural. Population density is what the census looks at as well, people per square mile. The age distribution, folks that are under the age of 18, also the working age, 19 to 16 for demographic, as well as those of retirement age 65 and over, the aging population. Ethnicity is looked at and measured, as well as education in terms of student age, also level of education, whether it's secondary, post-secondary, or postgraduate. Those are indicators as well. Income, household average income, the poverty levels, whether that's people that are in poverty not living in group quarters, individuals, families living at, under, or over the poverty level. And definitely income is something as an indicator, as well as employment, labor market information, the labor force representation within employment, forestry, fishing, game, mining, extraction, manufacturing, and other industries that are rural, and also commuting times to work. Housing is examined, the percentage of seasonal housing, perhaps also the percentage of housing that might not have plumbing facilities, whether it's in the kitchen or bath. That's looked at as well as a subdivision of these indicators. In fact, the Idaho Department of Labor does H-2A inspections of living quarters of those that are that have housed employment that provides housing rather in agriculture. So that's something that kind of ties in with this measurement. Household composition, for example, the percentage of people that are age 65 and over that might just be living alone. It could be a percentage of female heads of household with children under the age of 18. On the other side of the coin, there's something to be said about urban Idaho, really briefly. Idaho Department of Labor population projections have that with continued urbanization of Idaho, the highest growth projections are within the four largest urban counties. That's Ada, Bonneville, Canyon, and Kootenai collectively. These four counties are expected to grow by 177,700 people roughly through 2031. And that accounts for nearly 80% of the state's growth within those four counties. So as a result, with these projections, by 2031, more than 72% of Idaho's population is expected to reside more within urban counties. That's up from 70% in 2021. So basically, this just represents a 2% population shift from rural to urban counties in the next 7 years. If we're looking at population densities, we talked about that in the last slide with the people per square mile. Population density, with putting this in context with Idaho, Nebraska, and the nation of Gabon, Africa. They all have similar population densities. They're all rural areas, and they're all comparative in that way. So things are kind of spread out in these three geographies. In terms of landmass, Idaho's 83,000 square miles, and Nebraska's about 77,000 square miles, whereas the nation in Africa is 100,000 square miles, and it's even more rural than the two states. So Idaho is similar to Nebraska. It does have an agricultural output similar to Nebraska, but there is a population difference. With Nebraska, they've got two different urban hubs. That would be Lincoln and Omaha. Omaha has 500,000 people in it. So Idaho has the one Boise Metroplex area. If we look at Gabon, Africa, it has an economy that's dependent upon crude oil. And the reason I mention their crude oil economy is because those that live in rural areas only have access to employment opportunities in that particular industry. In that case, it's oil. And before the discovery of oil in Gabon, Africa, logging was the pillar of their economy. And logging and mining are the next most important income generators of their GDP. And basically the parallel that we can make here with that African nation and Idaho is access to most employment in some rural parts of Idaho may be limited exclusively to like forestry, natural resources, extraction, manufacturing, or farming, just to name a few examples, unless you're working in the school system or for the government in those local economies. So if we're looking at relative population densities kind of our bordering states in the province of British Columbia, you can see that there is kind of a comparison. The closest thing to Idaho would be Nevada with population density, and then the low densities of British Columbia and to our north, and then Montana and Wyoming to our east. We kind of find ourselves within a happy medium of surrounded by these states that are kind of diverse states. You could say that there's economic juggernauts like Washington and Oregon to our north and west, and then of course Nevada and Utah to our south. But here in Idaho, we are a rural state. That's kind of the fact of the matter. We do have a growing major city and amenities statewide attractive to in-migration and also tourist visitation. Now, we're going to switch gears here just a little bit. I spoke briefly before about rural demographics and rural counties being ideal locations for some people choosing to retire to those rural counties. And that segues into discussing the age 65 and over population in rural Idaho. And from our recent data release from July 2023 US Census population estimates, 21.4% of the population in rural Idaho counties is 65 and over, 21.4%. And that's twice as high as the state share of 65 uh, and over residents at 10.7%, represented by the horizontal orange baseline here on this graph. Nationally, it's at 11.5%, the share of the population 65 and over, to kind of give you a comparison. So we can see that the senior population skews much older in rural Idaho, and in rural counties like Adams, Custer, and Lemhi County, it's hovering around that 30% range as of 2023, and that's pretty astounding that almost a third of their population is uh, 65 and over. And many within this rural population, incidentally, might be farmers, ranchers, and large landowners, so that has an implication as well. As a visual representation, the trend lines of residents over 65 in rural counties and rural poverty rates align fairly closely, but higher cost of living, not as high of a cost of living in rural areas, though, does affect a lot of people on fixed incomes that are in that aging population. The theme here is not that the rural aging population are all in poverty. That's not really what we're conveying here. They're actually in really good shape with poverty as an overall average. There's just a higher representation of the 65 and over age demographic in rural counties than to the rest of the state that plays into this equation. But I thought that was kind of interesting how you can kind of see the fits and starts on this graph. It's not a time series, but it does show how it kind of ties in with the aging population up against poverty levels. So, kind of an interesting finding during the research here. So, with the 2021 census report, it indicated the Idaho senior poverty rate was under 10% compared to the national average at 10.3%. So that's why I say kind of take this with a grain of salt. The 2023 study by Seniorly ranked Idaho as the fourth most affordable place to retire on a budget. And that was just a recent survey. So if we turn to some of the aging trends, looking at the share of the population over 65 years of age, generally defined as a retirement age, as mentioned nationally, we're at 11.5% of the population that's 65 and over. And back in 2005, only 15 of Idaho's 44 counties had retirement age populations. On this graph, we're actually looking at 35 counties with retirement age populations. So if you're looking at 15 out of 44 counties in 2005 that had proportionately higher um, uh, 65 and over populations, we're at 20 more counties now than we were back in 2015. So there is an aging population since then. By 2015, the number did grow to 28 counties, including 26 out of 35 rural counties. And of Idaho's 9 urban counties, only 2, which were Kootenai and Nez Perce, had 65 and over populations that were proportionally larger than the national level of 15% at the time. So as of 2023, the share of the population that's 65 over in all of the rural counties averages 21.4%, as I mentioned. And that's shown here pretty clearly on this graph. These trends reveal that Idaho has increasingly become a destination for those of retirement age or people that were pre-existing residents of locations that already lived in rural counties for a time. It's projected that rural Idaho will statistically continue to become older than the national demographic profile. So let's go ahead and look at outmigration and unemployment rates. for all rural counties, regardless of age here.
All
The
right.
graph, all right, so this graph denotes rural county outmigration rates in relation to unemployment rates. Overall, the unemployment rates are still relatively low statewide, so we can't read into this too much. In a separate measure, most counties in Idaho have relatively low poverty rates when compared to the overall state rate. So there is some correlation to unemployment and rural outmigration here. 34% of the rural counties that are marked here in diamonds on this graph, on this scatter plot, had both higher unemployment rates and higher than average outmigration rates. So we were looking at a 3.1% unemployment rate that was benchmarked at the end of 2021. So that was a historical unemployment rate. And the outmigration coincided with higher than average annual outmigration rates. If we're looking at 4.1% outmigration. So the grouping of counties in the top right quadrant, roughly on this scatter plot outlined, that I have outlined here in orange, included Adams, Benoit, Blaine, Boise, Boundary, Butte, Camas, Clark, Elmore, Lewis, Teton, and Valley counties. So that's what you see in that quadrant there, represented by the diamonds as counties. And the scatter plot also shows that 86% of rural counties had higher unemployment than the state's 3.1% back in 2021, correlating to, again, outmigration rates that could be between 1 and 9% outmigration in the year. The only exceptions with lower unemployment were Caribou, Franklin, Fremont, Jefferson, and Oneida counties. And that attrition without migration may be kind of a combination of a lack of employment opportunities in addition to geographic isolation or lack of amenities. And it could be based more on a mechanism of people's individual behavior and decisions in reacting under certain conditions. So really my point is it's difficult to ascertain for sure if there is a direct correlation as a statewide trend with unemployment rates being the drivers of people leaving rural counties. And there appears to be no single set of characteristics that correlate to higher than normal nationwide county outmigration trends and effects. So this is a graph that charts real per capita personal income for the non-metropolitan wage earners of Idaho over time. Things have really gone well since 2009. There was a recession there in gray in 2009. Next to the left of 2010. And real per capita personal income is defined as the real personal income in today's dollars divided by mid-year population. The non-metropolitan portion of Idaho consisted of all counties in Idaho that were outside of metropolitan statistical areas, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And we can see on this U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis graph that real per person income was in decline for non-metropolitan Idaho just between 2021 and 2022, divergent with the direction of inflation at the time. And the gap does widen between personal income and prices of goods and services in these non-metropolitan regions of Idaho during that period of time. Then it's interesting to see the climb in non-metropolitan real personal income starting in 2019, pre-pandemic, that wasn't interrupted by the 2020 recession, and with momentum still rose even a year later. So there was some employment churn. People were migrating, landing better paying jobs, and the recessional lag effects in real personal income were more felt in 2022 as kind of the dust settled and the great resignation upheaval started to tail off and things were softening with the labor market. So the US Census and USDA take more of a broad national view on how rural definitions are laid out, more by population within geographies, as I'll show in some later slides. But they both use the same definition. Outside census places, and then the actual inside census places measured would be greater than or equal to 2,500 people, 10,000 or 50,000 people within a geography of how those are measured as actual census places. The rural locations are those outside urban areas that still have a population of people. And then we'll define a rural land a little bit later. This is talking about rural population within geographies. So this is just one way to look at it. As we kind of talked in the outset, it's defined in different ways. They also mentioned that they also use the criteria that rural is a non-metropolitan county. So this is kind of how their mapping goes. USDA using census definitions. First, I'll show you the rural Idaho mapping from a USDA and census perspective with two different maps. This is one of those. And the subsequent slides, I'll be mapping Idaho Department of Labor statistical areas for comparison on how we at the Idaho Department of Labor define rural geography. So anything yellow on this map is a rural location outside census places. And then notice the map legend, how it has those corresponding areas that are color coded there in the pink and red. You can probably consider these, you can consider those city limits rather than counties in this particular context. And they're based on the population sizes, again, greater than or equal to 2,500, 10,000, and 50,000 people. So there's 4 different designations here within this map according to population size. The second map here, again, it's color coded. In the legend, it does cover counties this time, and I like this one in that it does use county lines and county borders to define either rural or urban. Pretty straightforward, kind of on a federal broad view of how they define it. But you don't get a full picture, that being said, of what kind of rural counties they are. With this designation that the state of Idaho Department of Labor uses, you do get a better picture of what type of a rural county that falls under certain criteria. One of my colleagues, Sam Wolkenhauer, he's the economist up north. He articulated the actual Department of Labor definitions, and I use this graphic of his with the rural communities and how things are kind of broken down and defined. This happens to be one of the county line maps by designation. Either it's going to be rural, one of 3 types of rural designations, or an urban designation. So the definitions divide Idaho's 44 counties into categories. As you can see here, the 4 categories. Commuting rural, rural center, and open rural. And then everything in blue, every county in blue on here is going to be an urban county for the sake of our conversation. So urban counties are those that have the largest city of more than 20,000 residents. And 9 of Idaho's 44 counties meet the criteria of having more than 20,000 residents within one of the largest cities within their borders. The other 35 counties are all defined as rural, and commuting counties are where at least 25% of the population commutes to an urban county to work. And that could be an example like you have Fremont County here in the eastern region. 30% of their population at the time of this 2015 study was commuting into Madison County, where Rexburg is located. So that would be an example of a commuting county. And then you also have rural centers that are rural counties where the largest city has a population between 7,500 and 20,000 people. That's designated in purple on those counties. An example would be Bonner County, where the city of Sandpoint has a population of around 8,000 people up north there in the Panhandle. And then open rural counties are rural areas that have neither a commuting population or a large enough city to be classified in other categories. So it's everywhere else. It's open rural. These counties are half of Idaho counties. There's 22 of those, and they're defined as open rural. An example would be Lewis County. The largest city in Lewis County is called Kamaya. They're at about 1,500 people. And that would define them as open rural. They don't have a population of one of their cities at more than 7,500 people. So if we take a look at population designation from a state labor market angle, the way we at Idaho Department of Labor define statistical areas, I'm going to emphasize that all of these labeled color areas on the map are designated as MSAs or metropolitan statistical areas, except for, well, yeah, this one, they're all MSAs. So the area in pastel green color is designated as rural. But bear in mind, there are rural counties that fall within an MSA. An example here in Idaho Falls MSA, there in pink, would be you have Bonneville County as kind of the flagship populous county, and then you have Butte County and Jefferson County as part of the MSA because there is common economic and commuting and social linkages within those three counties to designate them as an MSA, and also for statistical reasons. On this particular example, the percentages you see on there would just be at a random point in time. Those are the unemployment percentages. But for the sake of this particular map, we're just looking at the labeled MSAs on there. It can be used for a lot of different reasons. You can look at unemployment rates within those geographical MSAs. You can look at other parameters like industry job growth and contraction. But a lot of the areas might be too sparse to gather data from, or they may not have adequate labor market information. And so those would be outside of metropolitan statistical areas if we can't gather data for those, or they just don't have labor market information readily available to classify them geographically. Furthermore, on the metropolitan statistical areas, they're characterized as having at least one urbanized area, as I mentioned, the Idaho Falls MSA, that would be our urbanized area, with a minimum population combined for those counties of 50,000 people. It defines a region that consists of a city and then the surrounding communities that are linked, again, by those social, commuting, and economic factors. And it groups counties into specific geographical areas for population censuses and compilations of related statistical data. An MSA also captures a wider geographical area for statistics than just the major city would, with consideration made to where workers reside and commute, etc. And basically, for all intents and purposes, with MSAs, they help government officials and businesses and stakeholders review information about per capita income, spending patterns, unemployment rates, as we mentioned. Real estate investors might even use MSA's data to study housing trends and population movement, and that would encompass both rural and urban counties. So that's important to know. Applicants for social services might fall within a certain MSA. They might look at their income levels for that MSA as to fall under or at a fixed percentage of their median gross income to qualify for assistance, including low-income housing and other forms of support. Idaho Department of Labor largely serves this demographic of people. And even though you might not live in an MSA and may not be rural by a statistical definition, it might still be rural by your own definition with the commutes to work and distances to amenities. I've had the opportunity to visit a lot of these rural areas, kind of the far reaches of the state and kind of these vast expanses of driving. And it's pretty enjoyable to go out to those areas and kind of see the regions. It's pretty eye-opening as well to kind of see how commerce works in those particular geographies, and also to kind of see how the citizens are and kind of their point of view, and to get to talk to people while we're out and about within these rural areas. So it's definitely a lot of good information to get it kind of boots on the ground feel for a lot of the rural environment that we can travel to for work or for pleasure, and to kind of get to know Idaho as a whole. These are Idaho Department of Labor statistical areas reclassified as micros or micro statistical areas. You can kind of see a little symbol before the SA there, the micro symbol, excuse me. And a small town America lens more to like what a micro statistical area would be. You kind of get the small town subdivision of geography that way. And you get more granular details of the small population centers. So a micro statistical area, by definition, the criteria has to be less than 10,000 people, but more than 50,000, but no more than 50,000 people. If you're at 50,000 people, you become a metropolitan statistical area. So there's a central county or counties, plus any other counties with strong commuting ties to them. And taken together, these requirements typically translate into it being more of a small town and the surroundings of the small town. Then you can subdivide these. I'm not going to show this map, but of course the cities themselves in the sub-state areas. One of my colleagues, Lisa Grigg, I wanted to kind of recognize her. She helped me kind of understand what a labor market area is in the gray there on the map. She actually, that covers her region there, the Idaho Lewis LMA for labor market area. And we consulted her on this. It's an economically integrated area where people can reside and find employment within a reasonable distance, or can readily change jobs without changing where they live. And it can also include both an MSA and a micro statistical area within the LMA. Everywhere else on the map in pastel green would be rural. As mentioned before, both micropolitan and metropolitan statistical areas can also be rural counties, so those can be included within these designations. So what may be some of the value sets placed on rural Idaho? Qualitatively or intrinsic value, the perceived implications of living rural may actually not be implications at all, because 27.8% of the state population chooses to live rural, and they're agents in themselves. They want to stay there. They recognize the benefits, and others living rural might be stuck there and be socioeconomically static, living rural, and they may want to move, but everybody's situation is different. Everybody puts a different value on it. On the other side, we could look at extrinsic quantitative values of living rural. You can actually put a number on that, industry output, state domestic product, regional domestic product, the outputs of certain industries that fall as rural come into play. So it's definitely a conversation. In this final slide, just wanted to look at some of the socioeconomic data as a cross section of some of the more crucial data that we can look at, and what distinguishes rural from statewide. Some of the data that stood out to me, at least. It compares the rural Idaho counties, those 35 counties, with statewide data in sort of a socioeconomic context. And according to the U.S. Census Bureau, I mentioned this earlier, rural land encompasses any land that's not in an urban area. Here at the Idaho Department of Labor, we define rural counties as commuting counties, open counties, or rural center counties. And these rural counties defined by the department are consistent with the methodology used here in highlighting counties with 99% or more of rural land area. So these are, again, the same 35 counties are also, not only do they have 99% more land, rural land area, but also they meet the criteria and definition of a rural county that the department uses. The urban counties, by the way, that were left off the first column but do fall within the Idaho statewide column would be Twin Falls, Madison, Leta, Nez Perce, Bonneville, Bannock, Kootenai, Camas, and Ada counties. Those are urban counties. And 27.8% of Idaho's population still lives in a county in Idaho containing 99% or more of rural land. So nearly 28%. And here's how the aggregation of the remaining 35 counties compare side by side with the state overall as we break down this data. Of course, there's less people per square mile in rural counties. The rural median age is relatively older, and slightly more residents are college educated or at least have bachelor's degrees from this measure. Rural home values are 20% less than that of the state median, so a little less expensive to live there, of course. Rural homeowner vacancy exceeded the statewide rate, and the total rural poverty rate was less than the statewide rate. From a labor market perspective, as of December 2023, the average rural employment stands at only 3.4% compared to 3.3% for the state. And the age 16 and over civilian non-institutionalized rural labor force comprises 40% of the state's overall labor force. Just a word about population and way of life, as Idaho was the fourth fastest growing state from 2022 to 2023. It'll be interesting to see how the future data kind of bears out and how it changes or stays the same, including this data that we took a cross section of. Depending on the circumstances, some people may migrate to Idaho. They expect to maintain or improve their financial station in life. Many do. It may be not what they expect either. If there's a lower wages than they're used to, or a higher cost of living, whatever the case may be, whether you're living in rural, urban, or somewhere else in between with Idaho, I think it's a really great place to live, and that's why we've come back 3 different occasions. And I believe that the state of Idaho is well equipped to forge ahead and meet the challenges mentioned at the outset. Many people come here for the rural aspect because we are a rural state, and that pace of life. And there's definitely those benefits. And this is basically the conversation and the considerations that we make as rural and urban Idaho residents. And we all live here for a reason, and we have our benefits that we enjoy, and the advantages of living here. So I'm going to leave it at that. If you have any questions at this point, I'm going to put it back in Craig's court there, and happy to entertain any questions.
All right, thank you, Ryan. Good job. I think you really went through over a lot of different ways of looking at rural. We don't have any questions from our audience members yet, but just if you have any questions, feel free to plug them into the Q&A there. I do have a couple questions for you in the meantime, Ryan. You went through all these different rural definitions. Did you get a sense of why there's so many different ways of these of defining rural, and how these definitions differ? I mean, what do you think what was your standpoint in terms of the mindset behind the different definitions?
Well, I really like that you can designate county borders. That simplifies things by county line. I do have something that I can share with you of kind of the comparison of what I saw, kind of the takeaways for me, and what helped me understand a little bit better, and the general audience might find this beneficial. There's maps and designations on what we consider rural. So my takeaways from this were you either have an urban county or a rural county, and that's the simplest way to look at it. If we're looking at map number 1, all of your urban counties are going to be designated there in blue. In Idaho, we only have 9 urban counties. But there's other ways of looking at rural. It's not as cut and dry. So with rural counties, you have the commuting counties there in yellow. And I thought that was interesting because they do have ties to urban counties where people commute, 25% of their citizens. With the green designation, that was the easiest because it's just open rural counties. None of the populations, none of the towns are over 7,500 people. But if you look over at how the state measures it, the state is using statistical data, and obviously stakeholders are going to use this data, and it's going to combine rural and urban designations. So nobody's really left out. I think it consolidates that nobody's left behind with statistics when decisions are being made in policy and so on. And also with people seeking benefits from the Idaho Department of Labor, they're going to look at where they live and where they're from, not just the county strictly. So I like that there's different ways to look at it and different designations so that it's all inclusive in all of these counties. Um, and I like how the state defines how county is rural. Counties are rural. It kind of simplifies things a lot easier than how on a federal level, on a census or USDA level, it might be. Uh, I think people get a little left behind that way. But that's kind of how those were kind of my takeaways. In the counties can include both rural and urban. That metropolitan statistical areas can include both rural and urban counties, and micropolitan statistical areas, same thing.
Um, Earlier you had mentioned, that you had a slide that talked about 65 plus population in counties. Did you find any other data points regarding 65 population out migration for some of these counties that you could expand on?
Yeah, definitely. So there's been a couple of studies done on both by AARP and also by some moving companies. In 2023, there was like U-Haul and different moving companies do their studies and statistics of sample sizes of people moving out of state. 3.4% out migration for the 65 and over retirement age is what Idaho reported in 2023 for out migration. There's another study by QMedic and the census nationally in 2022. Seniors 65 and over moved within the same state, 78%. 1.4 million out of 1.8 million remained in state with their moves. Now that could have been from a rural to urban, urban to rural, or vice versa, or different MSA. But it did track where people live, not necessarily where they work. And most people, when they're of that age, they find it that they kind of want to stay put. They want to age in where they're at, age in place. And after years of living in a community where they know everybody, they're being taken care of. They enjoy the activities. They have nearby friends and family. The tendency is for them to want to stay. The state is pretty solid on the data that there's 10.7% of the population that's still here, that's 65 and over. In rural counties, it's 21.4%. So I wouldn't say that they're a static population. They definitely move to warmer climates and do retire, but some people enjoy the way of life and they'll just stay where they're at. And according to this study, that would have only been 3.4% out migration in 2023.
All right, thank you. You have a question here. I'll just kind of read it as I'm going here. Because the rural aspect of Idaho is a draw to move here. People from people who live in rural cities are not necessarily open to the growth. How is there a balance between development that can increase access to services, medicine, food, and energy while maintaining the rural feel of those areas?
Well, that's a really good question. That's kind of a golden question. And again, it's subjective to people's preferences. Uh, Access to infrastructure was one of the concerns of the business leaders in that survey 3 years ago, and that's something that's being worked on by local politicians. It's also being worked on with the infrastructure, the various departments of the counties. They're looking at that, and to kind of strike that balance. I can just speak from personal experience. Um, I was, I lived, my paradigm was that I lived in the extreme super urban areas of the United States, living back into a rural area. And so for me, it was kind of that balance. I think what we're asking about here is the growth with development and things like that, trying to weigh that balance. That's up to kind of how the economy ebbs and flows with development. With housing in particular, workforce housing's a concern. how do you keep an economy going without a workforce and a place for them to live? So you have to strike that balance in that medium of where are people going to live and for what purpose, and where is the infrastructure available? Otherwise, you're commuting to the infrastructure and to the amenities. So it's basically up to someone's personal preference to strike that balance, where they want to live. Um, and if they're choosing to stay rural, there's always going to be those impacts coming their way of, are we going to see growth here in the community? Are we going to be developed? Are things closing in on us? I can tell you that my in-laws do live in an unincorporated area of Idaho right now, and there's a lot of apartments coming and closing in on them with the 10 acres that they live on. They've actually bought up farmland around them to try to prevent something like this, and so the zoning decisions are coming into play, and so they're facing that exact same dilemma that the audience member is asking about right now. Is how do you still have that balance of, I'm close enough to amenities, I still want to live rural, but then we do have development closing in around us. So that's kind of the golden question that a lot of people are considering right now, and the voting public, as well as the landowners. That's something to definitely consider um, with development and growth in various parts of the state.
Well, we just have a couple minutes left, and one kind of quick question for you. You kind of alluded to it a little bit. I just thought we'd bookend the way you started. So you keep leaving Idaho and keep coming back. I'm just curious how Idaho has changed your sense of rural that you were familiar with as you kept coming back, and did it change more recently as it compared? I suspect things have accelerated in terms of their change in the last couple of years, but what was your sense in terms of how things look different every time you came back?
Well, that's a good point as well. And by the way, I don't plan on leaving again. That we like it here, and we're permanent. Um, but what we've seen basically, if you're looking at Bonneville County, the growth here in Bonneville County, both commercially and residentially, is explosive growth. Things are going gangbusters with construction. It never Before we left, we didn't see so many 4-level apartment complexes as we do now. There's a lot of new amenities too that weren't available before. So we now have an arena. There's a convention center and an arena. And you wouldn't have seen that before with like semi-pro sports here. So you're seeing that slow growth. For us, what we've seen in the 3 different moves is home prices have definitely gone up. People, I think the cat's out of the bag and the secret's out that it's a great place to live here in Idaho. Before, I think it was a lot more rural when we first lived here back in 2016, and it has become a lot more developed, a lot more commercial and residential ownership and commerce. And then obviously, as I mentioned before, multi-level, multi-family living arrangements with rentals here. So from the first time we moved back to the last time, there wasn't much change between the first and second moves, but the second and third move over the pandemic, definitely we saw a lot more growth and development, and it wasn't the same Idaho that we remember when we moved here the first 2 times.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you, Ryan. All right. Well, we're at the 12 o'clock hour at the top of end of our time, but I would like to say that as our team will be looking more at rural and the issues facing it over the next coming months and years. This is certainly, we've kind of not really been paying attention to as much as we should. So it's something that we kind of are looking to focus in on again. So we'll probably have more webinars on rural issues again and focus on some of the more specific economic areas. Today's was just more about the definitions and some overview. So if we couldn't get to the topic you wanted today, my apologies, but we'll get there eventually. So I would say that Again, thank you for joining the webinar. Our next one's on March 12th. Sam Wokenauer, our Northern economist, will be providing a preview of the upcoming release of our 2022-2032 long-term industry and occupational projections. Again, that's March 12th. We'd also like to remind you that the Idaho Department of Labor has many services geared towards job seekers and employers, but we also include free access to labor market information that you can get at just go to lmi.idaho.gov, and that's our website. Up there in the menu, you'll see a regions page where you can access data from around the state and get the contact info for Ryan and his colleagues. And if you have any questions about today's labor market insight webinar, you're welcome to email Ryan or me or anyone on our team. So again, thank you for attending. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody. Good day and good luck to everyone. Thank you.